Stuck at the beach for Christmas. A Christmas on Palmar Island romance. Written by Susanne. Chapter 1. Cindy grabbed her bags and slammed the car door shut. This day had not panned out as planned. She should be dining on a cruise ship instead of being back here. Still angry about what had happened, she walked up the narrow concrete path to the red front door. The color was fading, and the paint was chipping off in places, but Cindy couldn't bring herself to repaint it. Her aunt had loved that door. Cindy took a deep breath to calm herself and stepped into the little two-bedroom house she'd left early that morning. She dropped her bags and pushed back a few strands of hair that had fallen into her face. She wasn't looking forward to unpacking everything. That could wait until tomorrow, Cindy decided. First she needed some food and a glass of wine. Cindy strolled into the kitchen and stopped dead in her tracks. The light in the bathroom was on. She could see it through the crack in the door. Strange. She could have sworn she had turned it off before she left. Cindy had almost reached the door when it swung open and hit her square on the head. Ouch, she yelped, startled at the sight of a large man with wet dark hair, wrapped in nothing but one of her large fluffy bath towels. Cindy grabbed her head. Before the first hot flash of pain started to subside, she paled, cold sweat running down her back. There was a stranger in her house. She needed to get out of here and then call the police. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" a dark voice boomed. "What do you mean, what am I doing here? What are you doing in my house?" The anger she'd been trying hard to contain for the past few hours let loose and overrode the fear she'd felt moments earlier. "You're the owner?" the stranger asked, tightening the towel around his hips, his voice softer and less threatening. He had nice abs, Cindy noticed absent-mindedly. "Of course I am. Question is, who are you, and what are you doing using my shower? And my towel?" She glanced pointed at his lower abdomen and watched his face go from pale to red. He looked tired, she noticed, with dark circles under his eyes. Maybe he was homeless and had broken in to take a shower and clean up. "If you leave now, I won't report this to the police," she told him. It was almost Christmas after all. "What?" He looked confused. "This is breaking and entering. I could have you arrested." He really needed to get the message and get out of here. "I'm not leaving. I've rented this place through the end of the year," he said as he pushed past her and disappeared into her bedroom. Cindy plopped down on the couch when she realized what was happening. He was renting her house. Her friend Chloe had made the arrangements weeks ago. Cindy picked up her phone and started scrolling through emails. There it was. Max Anderson was renting her little house from today through the 1st of January, the day she was supposed to return from her cruise. How could she have forgotten about this? She'd even confirmed with Cindy that he was planning on leaving before she would make it back from Charleston that evening. The bedroom door opened and Max stepped out, dressed in a pair of dark pajama pants and a long-sleeve t-shirt. He held a piece of paper out to her. "I really am renting this place," he said. "You're not supposed to be here." "I'm not," she admitted, hating how tired and defeated her voice sounded. "I'm supposed to be sailing through the Caribbean for the next 2 weeks." He dropped the paper on the coffee table and took a seat across from her. "I'm Max, by the way." "Cindy." "Nice to meet you," she said automatically, cringing when she realized what she'd said. "Sorry, it's been a long day." Max nodded. "What happened?" "My cruise got cancelled. Mechanical failure." She curled up on the couch, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Well, technically, it's just delayed by 4 days, but my vacation will be over before we make it back to port, so basically, it's cancelled." She was rambling and made herself stop. "That sounds disappointing." Max leaned back in his chair. "It is. I've been saving up for this trip all year." She looked at the printout in front of her. "I'm so sorry about this. My friend Chloe set this all up. She's getting into real estate." She pointed at the paper. With all the chaos today, I completely forgot. That's understandable. Not ideal, but I get it. I'm sure we can figure something out. Is there a hotel nearby? Cindy shook her head. Not unless you drive up towards Myrtle Beach. There are a few condos and beach rentals, but no hotels. She got up from the couch. Would you like a glass of wine? He nodded, and she walked into the kitchen to pour 2 glasses and fix a little snack. Food would help her think this through. What are you doing down here on Palmar Island? She asked, curious about what he was doing by himself at a sleepy beach resort on the South Carolina coast over Christmas. He followed her and held his hand out for the bottle and corkscrew she'd grabbed. I'm a writer. I'm down here to finish my book, he said as he pulled the cork out and poured the dark red Shiraz into the glasses she sat on the counter. That sounds interesting. What do you write? Cindy opened the fridge and pulled out the little bit of cheese, cold cuts, and pickles left. It wasn't much since she hadn't planned on being home until the first of the year. Political thrillers, Max said. Have you lived here long? He asked in an obvious attempt to change the subject. About 4 years. I inherited the house from my aunt. She picked up the plate of food and a box of crackers and carried them to the kitchen table. Max followed her with the 2 glasses of wine. When did you get in? She asked, before popping a piece of cheese into her mouth. About half an hour before you, he said. I hope I didn't scare you too badly. I needed that shower after the drive down. Cindy picked up her glass and took a sip of the tart wine. She waited for him to tell her more, but Max seemed to be one of those guys who didn't volunteer information. She knew the type. She used to be married to one. Where did you drive in from? New York City. Cindy blinked. That's a long drive, she said. Not too bad. I did it in under 14 hours. Max sounded proud of the accomplishment. Cindy had no idea if that was a good time or not. She nodded and kept her mouth shut. Max stacked some ham and cheese onto a cracker and popped it into his mouth. He had a strong, square jaw, she noticed, and just a hint of stubble. He was the kind of handsome guy she had hoped to have a harmless flirt with on her cruise. Nothing serious, just a bit of fun and to boost her self-esteem. They ate and drank in comfortable silence. We've both had a long day. I suggest we share your house tonight and figure all this out in the morning, Max said, after they'd finished their snack and emptied their glasses. Would you mind if I slept in my bedroom? There are fresh sheets on the guest one. He nodded and rose, dropping his plate and glass in the kitchen sink. Good night, Cindy, he said in a deep and husky voice. Chapter 2. Coffee? Cindy asked when Max stepped into the kitchen, rubbing his face and trying to wake up. He'd slept like a log after the long drive and their surprise encounter. Yes, please. He took a seat at the kitchen table and looked at her while she poured the black liquid into a large Christmas mug. I hope you like bagels, Cindy said before putting the mug in front of him. It had a large Santa face printed on the side. There isn't much food in the house, and I wasn't ready for a full grocery shop. Max noticed the paper bag sitting on the counter. Cindy pulled the bag open. Plain or cinnamon raisin? She asked. Plain. She put the bagels on plates and carried them over to the table before returning with cream cheese and 2 knives. Help yourself, she said. This is good. Right up there with the ones from my favorite shop in New York, he said after he'd taken a taste. Cindy smiled before taking a bite of her own, a bit of cream cheese stuck to her pink lips. She licked it off, and he had to swallow hard. She was an attractive woman, with her long dark hair and slim figure. Max rubbed the long stubble on his cheeks and took a big swig of coffee. He had to get his head in the game and figure out how he'd be able to meet his deadline. He couldn't afford to get distracted. So, no hotels. Who can I talk to about another rental? He asked. I called Chloe first thing this morning. She's asking around. So far, there's nothing else available for miles. She'll call if she finds something. Cindy's shoulders slumped, and she didn't look at him. This isn't good, he mumbled under his breath. He needed solitude and no disruptions to even have a shot at finishing this book on time. His agent had made it abundantly clear if he missed this deadline, the publisher was done with him. It could mean the end of his career. I have a book I have to finish by the end of the month. There's still a lot of work left, and I can't afford to drive home or go on a wild goose hunt to find something else. You could stay, she offered. I need peace and quiet to write. I'm not an easy person to be around when I'm under a tight deadline, Max said. I can't think of anywhere else to go either, Cindy said. Chloe's my only close friend, and that's not an option. She's a single mom who lives at her mother's house. She looked up at him, a silent apology shining in her eyes. He couldn't get mad at her or force her out of her own home. How could they make this work? The main thing is that you're not interrupted, she asked softly. Max nodded. That and some space to move around. I can't think when I feel cramped. Cindy put a finger to her lips. How about this? We both stay here, and I promise to spend my time reading or watching movies in my bedroom. Or I can head out for a few hours each day. That would give you the living room and kitchen to work. It wasn't ideal, but he was running out of options. If he was honest with himself, it was the only choice he had if he wanted a chance at salvaging his career. Let's give it a try, he said. Let's, Cindy agreed, before toasting him with her coffee. The small gesture made him smile. Maybe this week wouldn't be so bad after all. Cindy was going stir-crazy a few hours into the new arrangement. While her room was a lot larger than the guest bedroom, there wasn't much to do other than lie on the bed to read or watch TV. She preferred to be on the move and rarely just sat around the house, but she'd promised Max. She had offered to return at least part of his money, but he'd refused. That was a relief. Cindy needed the cash since the cruise line refused to refund her trip. All she'd received was a credit for a future trip she probably wouldn't have time to take. Cindy sighed and threw herself across the bed. She'd try reading. A Christmas Carol always cheered her up and got her in the mood for the holidays. This time, even Dickens let her down. She had to get out of this room. Staying hidden away so Max could write was a lot more challenging than she had thought. Cindy walked into the kitchen to grab some water, trying to be as quiet as possible. She peeked into the living room. No sign of Max. He wasn't sitting at the kitchen table either. He must be working from his bedroom. While sipping her coffee, she got an idea. What her place needed was a bit of Christmas cheer. Her decorations were packed in boxes in the attic above the kitchen. If she was careful, she should be able to get them down without making too much noise. Surely, hanging a few lights and garlands wouldn't interrupt Max's writing process. She smiled at the thought of spending a relaxing afternoon sorting through ornaments and picking out which of her aunt's counted cross-stitch projects she'd want to display this year. Aunt Lydia had created a new one each year, and Cindy inherited them all with the house. A few of them weren't finished. Every year, Cindy vowed to complete them and never found the time to work on it. Despite this, choosing a few of the framed pieces to hang up had become a favorite holiday tradition. Glancing down the hallway, she made sure the coast was still clear, before opening the small hatch to the attic and pulling down the ladder. It was dark and dusty up there, with a single, bare light bulb to illuminate the space. She should really clean it up. But not today. Cindy strode over to the corner that held several large boxes labeled Christmas. Ignoring the dust, Cindy sat on the floor and opened the first one. A few hours later, she had sorted through every little holiday heirloom she owned. Most of the stuff could stay. The things she wanted to use this year were piled into 3 small boxes that were stacked next to the attic opening. Cindy made her way back to the ladder and knocked a smaller box of Christmas lights down. It crashed down to the kitchen floor. "What are you doing up there?" Max bellowed from below her. "Sorry," Cindy replied. I was grabbing a couple of things from the attic. Yes, I could hear that. You've been making noise for hours. I'm trying to be patient, but I'm not sure this will work out. I need to focus, and all that bumping and going on is distracting. Max's voice sounded strained. Cindy started to make her way down with one of the boxes, getting it stuck in the small opening. Hand me that box, he said curtly. Cindy pushed the container up and climbed back into the attic. She handed the boxes, one at a time, to Max, who stacked them on the kitchen table. Thank you, Cindy said, closing the hatch and wiping the dust from her jeans. I didn't realize the noise was distracting. I was trying to be quiet. Max nodded, turned, and strode into the living room. He picked his laptop off the coffee table and stretched out on the couch. Cindy figured it was best to leave him be. Taking the box of ornaments with her, she went back to her bedroom. She was going to be as quiet as a mouse the rest of the day. Chapter 3. Max shut his laptop and tossed it on the couch. The words weren't flowing. He'd spent the morning either staring at a blank screen or writing a few paragraphs and deleting them just as quickly. He was stuck. And there was no one but himself to blame. After the brief box incident this morning, Cindy had turned into a ghost. He'd heard barely a sound from her until about an hour ago when she'd walked into the kitchen and offered to make him a sandwich for lunch. She'd mentioned taking a nap after they'd eaten. From the sound of it, or lack thereof, that's exactly what she was doing. He had the living area to himself. That should make for ideal writing conditions, yet all he'd been able to think about was her. Max regretted being so harsh earlier. She'd been a very accommodating roommate, and he'd let his frustration with himself out on her. Curious what she'd been digging in the attic for, Max walked into the kitchen to look at the open boxes on the kitchen table. They were Christmas decorations, and the small box that had come crashing down was full of strings of lights. For the first time, he noticed that she didn't have any holiday ornaments out. There wasn't even a tree. Cindy probably didn't bother with her travel plans. He had an idea for what he could do to apologize for his earlier behavior. Grabbing his keys and his jacket, Max headed out the door. 45 minutes later, he struggled to get the small blue spruce into the living room. The bedroom door opened, and Cindy stumbled out looking adorable with tousled hair and sleepy eyes. "Did I wake you?" Max asked, unable to keep the grin from his face. The irony of the situation didn't escape him. She ran her fingers through her hair, before tucking it behind her ears. She yawned. Sort of. I couldn't figure out what the bumping was. Her eyes widened. You got a tree. The excitement in her voice caused a warm and fuzzy feeling in his chest. Going out and getting a Christmas tree had been the right choice. Do you have a tree stand? Max asked. Cindy nodded. Up in the attic. She left and came back with a simple metal stand a few minutes later. They had the tree up and watered in no time. The entire living room smelled like Christmas. Let's hope these lights still work, Cindy said, carrying the box she'd dropped earlier in the day. She pulled on a piece of cord and the entire bundle came out. It was a mess that would take a while to untangle. Max smiled at the memory of growing up and listening to his dad mutter under his breath as they worked with their own strings of lights. It didn't take them too long to sort it out. Cindy plugged in the first string of colorful tiny lights and all but one lit up. The second set had no issues at all. Looks like we're good to go, Max said. He grabbed one end of the cord and started to work his way around the tree. Cindy did the same with the second one. The corner of the living room where they'd set the tree was a tight space. Max was standing close to Cindy. He smelled the faint honey and vanilla scent of her shampoo and felt the warmth radiating off her body. It did something to him. He felt drawn to her and wanted to run his hands over the rich brown hair that framed her face in soft waves. He didn't remember the last time he'd felt this kind of attraction. Cindy dropped her string of lights and pulled the hair up in a quick, messy bun. He liked that even better. He noticed her long, slender neck, and the new dew made her large brown eyes pop. His own were drawn to her soft, red lips. They had just a hint of shimmer, maybe from some gloss or chapstick. It was hard to tell, but suddenly all he could think about was kissing her and finding out if her mouth was as soft as it looked. Cindy stepped even closer, and her hands brushed over his as she adjusted one of the strings of lights. He felt small sparks travel all the way up his arm at the brief connection. A small crack and a hissing sound jolted him out of his thoughts. They both jumped back at the sight of actual sparks coming from one of the strings of lights. Max yanked at the cord, pulling it out of the socket. The sparks from the cord of lights stopped. He couldn't say the same about the ones between the two of them. Seriously, this is the best meatloaf I've ever had. Max pushed his plate away and leaned back in the chair. His day may have started off a little bumpy, but things had turned around for the better after he'd gotten the tree. Sure, the Christmas light incident had caused a bit of excitement, but all was well that ended well. Cindy had tossed the offending string of lights, and they'd spread out the other a little further to light up the entire tree. With that done, Cindy had gone grocery shopping, giving him a bit of quiet time to write. To his surprise, he'd gotten a lot done. His novel had grown by several thousand words, and he was feeling good about himself. Jack, his agent, had been pleased with the progress as well. "How's the book coming along?" Cindy asked. "Or is this something I shouldn't mention?" She took a sip of her sweet tea. "No, that's fine. It's going much better, actually." Taking a break to set up the tree helped. "Sometimes you just can't force the words," he shrugged. It was hard to explain the frustration of writer's block to someone who wasn't in the biz. "How long have you been working on this book?" He laughed. "Too long. Almost 2 years. My publisher isn't thrilled with me right now." He played with his fork. "The whole industry has changed with ebooks and self-publishing. There's more competition." Cindy nodded. He wasn't sure how much she knew about any of this. He'd noticed that she was an avid reader and used her Kindle often. Traditional publishing houses like mine are under a lot of pressure, and writers missing deadlines isn't helping. I've gotten lucky. I had some success with my first 2 books and have gotten some decent advances for each successive one. It's allowed me to stay a full-time writer." "That's quite the accomplishment," Cindy said. "I don't think many people can do that." He nodded and turned to look out the window at the dim lights across the street. "It's difficult, but I can't imagine doing anything else." "But you're in trouble if you don't get this book finished in time?" she asked. "Yes. They won't offer me another advance, or they might drop me altogether if I can't deliver." Making it as a writer was hard. Continuing to make a living wage had become even tougher. "That's a lot of pressure." He shrugged. "It's part of the job." Unfortunately, that meant he couldn't afford to have any distractions until this book was done. Not even if they looked cute in a Christmas t-shirt and made amazing meatloaf. "I'd better let you get back to work." Cindy stood and took both of their plates over to the sink. "How about some coffee?" she asked. "I'll bring it in when it's ready." Chapter 4. Cindy turned on the coffee maker and started washing the dirty dishes in the sink. She had enjoyed dinner, and Max seemed appreciative of her cooking. It was nice to fix a home-cooked meal. More often than not, she'd pick up something from the restaurant at the end of her shift. To her surprise, she enjoyed having someone around. Max was a charming, good-looking guy. Until he'd stormed in to yell at her for quietly digging through some boxes. Cindy shook her head and vigorously scrubbed the meatloaf pan. She shouldn't get emotionally involved. She'd only offered to share her house with a stranger because he had nowhere else to go. It was the right thing to do, and he'd paid her well. She walked over to the kitchen table to wipe it clean. Max had left his sweater hanging over the back of the chair. The corner of the living room where he'd sat most of the day to write was drafty. She should replace the window behind the couch. Cindy picked the sweater up to take to Max. She could smell his aftershave and thought back on the moment they'd shared hanging lights on the Christmas tree. For a moment there, she'd thought he might kiss her. Then sparks flew, literally, and the moment was gone. Something had changed though. He seemed more relaxed around her tonight. Until he was ready to get back to work. He was a bit of a mess, this unexpected renter of hers. He was definitely not used to sharing a space with someone else. Not that she was either. It had been a long time since she lived with someone. Their arrangement had its challenges, but it was nice not to come home to an empty house. Cindy heard Max typing away in the living room. And he muttered to himself, she realized. It made her smile. Work must be going well. Coffee is ready, and I thought you may want your sweater, she said when he looked up. I'm heading out for a bit to visit an old friend. I'll be back in a few hours. The look he shot her was strange. Was there a hint of jealousy in his eyes? We need to do this more often, Miss Doris said while grabbing another slice of apple spice cake. Cindy nodded in agreement, a bite of cake in her mouth. It was delicious. The two women sat in Miss Doris's living room. The older lady was a frequent customer at Mary's, and when she found out that her favorite waitress was Lydia Henderson's niece, she'd insisted Cindy come over for Sunday lunch after church. They'd been friends ever since. We really do. I'm sorry I've gotten so busy, Cindy stopped herself. That's not right. I'm sorry, I haven't made the time to come and see you. Miss Doris smiled and waved her hand. Don't worry about it. I haven't exactly been making an effort either. Let's just resolve to do better. We can think of it as an early New Year's resolution. Yes, let's. How's Sarah? She asked. Miss Doris's great-niece had been staying with her at the beachfront house for the past few months. She's ready to pop, Miss Doris said, joy and anticipation twinkling in her eyes. It won't be long now. Oh. I haven't had a chance to tell you. Miss Doris leaned in conspiratorially. Sarah ran into the baby's father on Main Street right around Thanksgiving. They've been spending a lot of time together. That explains it. I was wondering who she was having dinner with the other day. I hope things work out for them, Cindy said. Being single and pregnant couldn't be easy. A few weeks after her husband had walked out for the last time, Cindy had suspected she was pregnant. The thought of raising a child by herself had terrified her. Now, she was grateful her short and unhappy marriage hadn't resulted in any offspring. There was no way she could have handled working 60 hours a week at Mary's and take care of a kid. So do I. Miss Doris looked concerned. Everything okay? Not quite, but I think it will be. There was a misunderstanding earlier today, and Sarah needs a little time to realize he cares for her and the baby. I pray it will work out, but enough about that. Explain to me again what happened with your cruise, Miss Doris said, jolting Cindy out of her thoughts. There was some mechanical issue, and the ship is stuck in port for at least 4 days. And they wouldn't let you stay? Cindy shook her head. They would have. But they also would have extended the trip for a few more days. I'm due back at work on the 2nd. So, I came on home. Of course, I completely forgot about the renter. Cindy stopped, but it was too late. There was no way to take back her last few words. Miss Doris pounced. A renter? I didn't realize you had someone staying at your place. How's that working out? Miss Doris was an old pro at vacation rentals and frequently had people stay in the guest cottage on her property. Occasionally, she'd even rent out one of the extra rooms in the old beach house she owned. Chloe set it up for me. She's getting her real estate license and is trying to start selling and renting property on the island. Cindy held her breath and hoped Miss Doris would take the bait. She'd much rather gossip about her friend than Max. Did that make her a horrible person, she wondered. I ran into Chloe the other day at Amy's flower shop. Which reminds me. I have the most charming young man renting my cottage. His name is Chris, and he develops those funny little games all you young people play on your phones. Cindy wasn't sure who this Chris was, but she wasn't afraid to use him. What kinds of games? She asked. Oh, I don't know. He's been seeing a lot of Amy though. I made sure of that. Miss Doris smiled and took another bite of cake. Playing matchmaker again? Cindy teased. Maybe. So, tell me about this person who's renting your place. And how does that work, now that you're back? Don't you start getting any ideas. We're managing, Cindy admitted, embracing the fact that she wasn't getting out of this conversation. He's a writer, she continued. He's finishing a book and his agent thought this was the place to get him over his writer's block. Miss Doris nodded and picked up her coffee. That sounds interesting. We're making it work. He wasn't too pleased I was back. But you know how crowded it gets around the holidays. No other rentals were available, and he didn't want to drive all the way back to New York. That's understandable. The weather is horrible up there this time of the year. I saw on the news that they had another blizzard. How is it having someone staying with you? Your house is pretty small for two strangers to share. It's been a challenge, Cindy admitted. He needs lots of quiet time to work on his book. I've been reading and watching quite a few Hallmark Christmas movies. Miss Doris clapped her hands together. I love those. I've been watching them too. It's so nice that they have them on all day right now. Miss Doris was a big romance fan. Not many people knew, but she'd confessed to Cindy that an entire wall of her bedroom was nothing but a shelf stuffed full of romance novels. They are. I'm trying to give him space. It's why I came here this afternoon. Cindy blushed at the admission. I'm glad you chose to visit me. I'm sure it's strange to have a man back in the house. Miss Doris gave Cindy an encouraging smile. It's been different, that's for sure, Cindy said and barked out a laugh. I hope he's nothing like Jeff. When Cindy didn't reply right away, a look of concern washed over the older woman's face. Is he? No, not at all. He's set in his ways and a little stressed out about his book deadline, but he's nothing like Jeff. Cindy didn't like to talk about her verbally abusive deadbeat of a husband who would take off for weeks at a time without so much as a word. She was glad that chapter of her life was behind her since her divorce had been finalized last year. Good. Not many men are like him, you know. I'm sure you'll find someone wonderful to share your life with. Cindy wasn't so sure and looked down at her hands, uncomfortable with the turn the conversation had taken. I don't know about that, she mumbled. I know you will. You just have to keep an open mind and an open heart. Miss Doris smiled at her encouragingly. We'll see. After the first of the year, I'll be busy at the restaurant. I called Mary this morning and asked her for a few extra shifts. This vacation ate up a lot of my savings. It was probably a mistake. Cindy stopped when she heard the phone ring. Miss Doris rose to answer it. Hi, Ryan. Yes, she's fine. Miss Doris listened for a moment. I'm sorry. She's not ready to talk to you. Give her a little time. Cindy played on her phone and did her best not to listen in on the conversation. A few minutes later, Miss Doris hung up and returned to her seat. I'd better get back and let you deal with this, Cindy said, noticing the concern in her friend's eyes. She stood and grabbed her jacket and purse. Hang on a minute, hun. Miss Doris put a hand on Cindy's arm. Let me wrap up a slice of this cake for your writer friend. You know what they say. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Cindy knew it was useless to try to stop her. And who knew? Maybe she was right. Chapter 5. Max was feeling the crunch. He'd made a lot of progress the past 2 days, but it had started to take its toll. Writing 8,000 words per day used to be no big deal, but he was out of practice and felt it. His hands cramped, and he had a raging headache. He got up and found Cindy in the kitchen, working on a cross-stitch project. Max saw quite a few red, green, and gold pieces of floss on the table. "Do you have any aspirin?" he asked, rolling his shoulder to relieve some of the tension in his neck. "Sure." "Headache?" She set the piece she was working on down and walked to the bathroom, grabbing something from the medicine cabinet. "Here. Try this too." She handed him the aspirin and a small bottle. "What's this for?" Max glanced at the label. It said peppermint in neat handwriting. He opened the bottle and sniffed. Yep, definitely peppermint. The scent was strong enough to make his eyes water. "It's peppermint oil. You put it on your temples." She took the glass bottle from his hand. Her fingers brushed across his, and he felt the warmth he'd experienced the other day return to his heart. Touching her, even when it was accidental, did something to him he'd never experienced before. It went beyond simple physical attraction. Max watched her dab a few drops of oil on her fingertips. Rubbing both hands together, she stepped up to him. She was close enough that he could feel her breath tickle his neck. He held his own and stood still as her hand reached up to apply the peppermint. "Here," she said. "Like this." Her voice sounded husky. She seemed as affected by the closeness of their bodies as he was. Max felt the oil on his temples. It was cool and hot at the same time, and it made his face and scalp tingle. The peppermint scent became stronger until it was all he could smell. Cindy walked to the sink and washed her hands. "Be careful that you don't rub any in your eyes. It burns." She grabbed a glass and filled it with water. "Here." He popped an aspirin and washed it down. "Thank you." He took a deep breath, inhaling more of the peppermint. "I think it's already helping." Cindy left. "It's fast, but not that fast. Sounds like a placebo effect to me." "You've got a point there. Either way, I'll take it. If you're ready to take a break from writing, we could go take a quick walk. You look like you could use some fresh air." She looked him up and down, and Max noticed his disheveled appearance. He'd rolled out of bed that morning and went straight to work. He nodded. "I should change." "Probably," Cindy agreed, her lips twitching into a small little lopsided smile that gave her adorable dimples. "Where to?" he asked as they left the house. "How about a quick walk down to the park? It shouldn't take us more than 45 minutes there and back. They light it up for Christmas, and all the houses around the place are decorated as well," Cindy said. "It turns into quite the competition." She wasn't exaggerating. The small neighborhood park had a fair amount of lights, but it was nothing compared to the houses surrounding it. "You weren't kidding. There's a Christmas light battle going on down here." Max couldn't keep his eyes off her face. Seeing Cindy's joyful excitement at the colorful displays was intoxicating. That's when he knew. He was falling for her. Somehow this felt different from his previous relationships. He laughed at the curveball fate had thrown him. There he was, the perpetual bachelor and professed loner, living with a woman and enjoying the experience. "What?" Cindy asked. "I realized how happy I am down here. It surprised me, that's all." He wasn't ready to share his deeper realization. Max could see the two of them having a future together, but the details were still murky. Like with the plot of his stories, he needed a little time to let the idea stew and develop into something more. And then there was the location issue. Her life was there, his in New York City. Could he see himself moving to Palmar Island? He could write anywhere, and so far the island had been inspirational. It was something to think about. Eek. Max heard Cindy yelp as he watched her trip over something small on the sidewalk. His hand shot out to steady her. He grabbed the first thing he got a hold of, her outstretched hand. "You okay?" he asked once she was firmly back on her feet. Cindy nodded, looking pale. He felt her hand shake. Max looked down to see what had caused the stumble. A single roller skate sat in the middle of the sidewalk. He kicked it into the grass. One of the kids from the neighborhood must have left it, Cindy said. Just one skate? I wonder what happened. Max started to think about what may cause a young child to leave one of her roller skates out there. The beginning of an idea for a short story started to form in his mind. He mulled it over, deep in thought, as they started to make their way back home. It wasn't until they reached the house, and Cindy dug around for her keys, that he realized he'd been holding her hand the entire time. Chapter 6. Cindy hung up the phone. When would it stop? Everything okay? Max asked. He'd walked in on the tail end of her conversation with the bill collector. It will be. I think. Cindy hated how unsure she sounded. It's about my ex-husband. He keeps running up debt, and they end up calling here. I thought I'd be done with those once I paid off the last of our joint cards, but the calls keep on coming. I tell them he doesn't live here anymore and that we're no longer married. That's usually the end of it, but this guy was insistent on getting his money. She shrugged. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. She nodded. There wasn't much she could do, even her attorney had said so. Changing her phone number had only helped for a few weeks. She could move, but the house meant too much. Cindy barely noticed when Max left the kitchen. She was lost in bad memories of her ex and the financial mess he'd left her with. It had taken years to clean it up and even longer to get the divorce finalized. If it wasn't for Aunt Lydia, Cindy wouldn't have made it. Her aunt took her in when she needed a place to stay and left Cindy the house in her will. When she made the last payment on the old debt, she'd sworn to herself and her aunt she'd never put herself in a situation where she depended on a man for anything. She had her own place, a job that paid well, and only herself to contend with. She'd been happy that way for years. She didn't need anyone but herself. This was a great idea. Exactly what I needed to clear the cobwebs from my head, Max said. I'm glad. I love the Christmas festival. It's my favorite place to find fun gifts for friends who are a little hard to buy for. Cindy smiled and looked at some of the local craft vendors. They do this every year? Max asked. Yep. The 4 weekends leading up to Christmas. It started small, but over the years the town added carnival rides and kids' activities. The live music is new. Cindy heard a band playing in the distance. The singer sounded amazing. We should check it out, Max said, walking towards the small stage. They are great. Cindy hadn't realized she was swaying to the music until she caught Max looking at her. Want to get some food? She asked. Max laughed. Sure, I could use a snack. Those apple pies look good. He pointed to a stall that sold them by the slice. 1 slice of apple pie and 1 pumpkin, please, Cindy requested. Max insisted on paying. Would you like whipped cream on that? The friendly vendor asked. Max nodded and ended up with a mountain of it. Cindy grabbed 2 spoons, and they walked off with their treats. You who? Cindy. She turned and saw Miss Doris waving. They stopped to wait for the older lady to join them. Cindy made the introductions. So, you're the writer from New York. Welcome to Palmar Island. Miss Doris beamed at Max. What in the world are you eating? You didn't get the apple pie from Patsy's stand over there, did you? There's a reason they add all that whipped cream. It's to cover up the pie. She leaned in. I think it's store-bought, she whispered loudly. Cindy left. There's nothing wrong with store-bought. We don't make everything from scratch at the restaurant. You don't advertise it as homemade though, Miss Doris said. And I know Mary would never put a pie on the menu she didn't bake herself. True, Cindy admitted. Her boss was an amazing baker and the sweet treats were one of the reasons the restaurant was so popular. Tell you what, Miss Doris turned to Max, I'll make you a real southern apple pie before you leave. Something you won't be able to get in New York. That's very kind, Max replied. Have you seen the wreaths yet? Miss Doris asked. Cindy, get one for your front door. All proceeds go to charity. Before they had a chance to answer, Miss Doris guided them toward a covered stand filled with racks of beautifully decorated Christmas wreaths. Cindy stepped next to Max to look around. What do you know, there's a bit of mistletoe hanging right above your heads, Miss Doris said. You know what that means. I'll leave you two to it. Cindy heard a soft giggle as her friend walked off, leaving her next to Max. He looked up at the small branch tied with a piece of ribbon and then at her. Holding his pie off to the side, Max leaned in. He moved slowly, leaving her plenty of time to stop him. She didn't. His lips gently brushed across hers before he deepened the kiss. She thought about stopping him. Instead, she kissed him back, tasting a hint of whipped cream. The kiss was brief, but from the look in Max's eyes, it had affected him as much as it had her. He pulled her in for a hug, and she let the scent of his aftershave calm her. A memory of Aunt Lydia flashed before her closed eyes. Promise me you'll live your life to the fullest, her aunt had requested, just a few days before she passed. With no regrets. Cindy hoped getting involved with Max wasn't something she would regret down the road. There was only one way to find out. Chapter 7. Max slammed his laptop shut and stood, rubbing the muscles of his aching back. He'd written himself into a corner, and no matter what he tried, he couldn't backtrack his way out of it. He started to pace around the living room, working through his options. His usual strategy of writing something else and coming back to the main piece with a fresh perspective wasn't an option. Neither was asking his editor or one of his writing buddies for input. It would take them days to read his rough draft. And this was Christmas Eve. Most people he knew weren't working today. They were busy spending time with their families. He had to figure it out and fast, or there was no way he'd make his December 31st deadline. He needed inspiration, or at the very least, a good luck charm. Max strode into the kitchen to look for his lucky sweater. It was a ratty old thing that had seen better days, but he'd written some of his best work wearing it. Surely, it would do the trick. It had to, or his career was over. Max swallowed a bit of bile at that thought. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. He needed his sweater. It was nowhere to be found. He looked everywhere. Becoming desperate, he walked outside to ask Cindy. She was sweeping the back deck and stopped as he approached. Have you seen my sweater anywhere? The light gray one I've been wearing around the house? It's in the dryer. I washed it this morning. It looked like it needed it. Cindy went back to sweeping the dry leaves. What? He turned and ran to the small laundry closet next to the bathroom. That wasn't good. As thin and worn out as it was, he wasn't sure it would make it through another wash. It's why he'd mostly been airing it out and occasionally hand-washing it, trying to get a little more life out of his lucky charm. He heard Cindy walk in behind him as he pulled the dryer door open. The sweater was balled up between several pairs of jeans. He pulled it out and let out a curse. It was torn to shreds, completely useless. Do you know what you've done? He raged, shoving what was left of his sweater into her face. You've ruined it. What were you thinking? You just randomly do someone's laundry and ruin their clothes? He took a deep breath. His temper was getting the better of him, and he could feel the heat in his face. Trying to calm himself down, he paced back and forth through the kitchen, mumbling under his breath and only occasionally shooting angry glares Cindy's way. She stood there, frozen with eyes wide open for a moment. She blinked, shook her head as if to clear it, and walked over to the kitchen counter. She grabbed her purse and walked out the door. Good riddance, Max thought. She'd killed his career after all. When he finally calmed down, he realized how ridiculous that thought had been. She didn't ruin it. All she did was toss a dirty sweater in with her laundry. He'd been the one missing deadline after deadline, choosing to meet friends for brunch or catch a ball game instead of putting in the time he knew it took to write a good novel. Max flopped down on the couch and dropped his head into his hands. He'd messed up and hurt the woman he cared about. They'd only known each other for a few days, but he had grown more than a little fond of her. He lifted his head when he heard a knock on the door. By the time he stood, the bell rang. He walked to the door, hoping it was Cindy. Maybe she forgot her keys. Max pulled the door open, and his heart dropped. It wasn't Cindy standing there with a covered pie tin in her hands. It was her meddling friend, Miss Doris. "I brought that apple pie I promised you," she said, pushing in past him. "I can't stay long. I need to head back to the hospital. My great-niece had her baby this morning," she said, putting the pie on the kitchen counter. "Where's Cindy?" Max dropped his chin to his chest. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks at the thought of what he'd done. "I ran her off." "What are you talking about?" Miss Doris said, pulling out a chair and sitting down at the table. "Sit." It didn't sound like a request. He did, taking a deep breath, before looking up at her. "I messed up," he said, before telling her about the sweater incident. "That wasn't very fair, was it?" Miss Doris asked. Her voice was kind, and he saw compassion in her eyes. "How much has she told you about her ex?" Max wasn't sure what that had to do with anything. "Not much. Jeff wasn't a very nice person. He had a temper and wasn't afraid to let it out on Cindy." Max paled. She'd judge his outburst through that lens. She probably thought he was just another deadbeat guy with anger issues, looking for someone weaker to hurt to make himself feel better. And she wasn't wrong. That's exactly what he had done. It also wasn't like him. Not really. He'd been under a lot of stress, but that was no excuse. He dropped his head in his hands and let the shame roll over himself. He'd messed up. Max lifted his head when he felt a warm hand on his shoulder. Miss Doris was standing in front of him. "We can fix this," she said. "Here's what you're going to do. Tell that child to calm down." The older woman's head tilted back, her eyes gazing upward. Her lips were pursed and Cindy could tell Karen's patience was running thin. Chloe rolled her eyes. "I'll try, Mom. But there isn't much I can do." He's excited. She rose and ran after her 4-year-old son, Toby. "It's Christmas Eve." Cindy glanced toward the door and shifted in her seat. "I know, and Chloe is right. He's such a good boy most of the time, and I love having him around. It's just that he's been this hyper all day. I'm ready for a little quiet time." Karen smiled apologetically. "I don't want to play Legos," they heard Toby's whiny voice drift down the hallway. "What if we watch Rudolph together?" Chloe walked back in, Toby trailing behind her. "Do you mind?" she asked her mother. Karen shook her head, and Chloe turned on the TV and searched for the movie. "I haven't seen this since I was little," Cindy said, finding herself charmed by the holiday classic. "I forgot how good it is." Toby had settled down and was mesmerized by the reindeer dancing across the screen. The four of them were drawn into the story of Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer who ended up saving Christmas. Cindy barely registered the doorbell ringing until Chloe walked back into the living room, Max trailing behind her. "Can we talk?" he asked. Cindy nodded. "Why don't you step into my room?" "First door on the left," Chloe said. They did, and Max shut the door behind them. Cindy perched on the side of Chloe's bed. Max lowered himself onto Toby's toddler-sized one. It was a bright red race car bed. Cindy was tempted to smile at the sight. Max looked right at her. "I'm sorry. I feel horrible for how I behaved earlier and that I ran you out of your house. I was frustrated with work, but that's no excuse. I wanted to apologize in person." She saw the sincerity and raw emotion in his face. "You're right. That was horrible and uncalled for." Cindy squared her shoulders and sat up a little straighter. "I get that you're under a lot of stress, and I've cut you some slack when you don't answer my questions or leave dirty coffee cups all over the house. But I will not let people yell at me like that." Not you, not anyone. It felt good to get that off her chest and get her power back. Walking out earlier seemed a little too much like running away. Having him come after her was different. Jeff would never have bothered. I understand. I promise it won't happen again. He looked like he meant it, but could she trust that? Cindy bit her lip. Would you like me to leave? He asked. I can pack my things and get on the road tonight. He paused. If that's what you want. Cindy shook her head. You'd never finish the book in time. Taking a shaky breath, she stood, her mind made up. Stay. But promise me you won't talk to me like that again. Max struggled to rise. I promise, he said and held out his hand. She shook it, hoping he was as serious as he looked. Are you ready to come home? He asked. The phrase threw Cindy for a loop. It sounded like he was talking about her house as their home. Maybe that's what it was becoming, because she had a hard time picturing it without him. It was why his earlier rant had bothered her so much. That little scene hadn't fit with the image she painted in her mind about the two of them. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to step back into her little house. Chloe had offered her the living room couch for the night. Max cleared his throat. Sorry, I was thinking about something else, she lied. Not yet. I promised Karen to take her to Midnight, Massachusetts. She doesn't drive in the dark. Who's Karen? Chloe's mom. Chloe has her hands full with Toby. She can't take her. Cindy smiled at the thought of Toby in church. And Chloe can't take her son to Massachusetts. Max followed her train of thought. Cindy nodded. Exactly. Karen hasn't been in years, and after the day she's had, she deserves some peace and quiet. I don't know how quiet a Christmas Mass is. I'm sure the church will be packed. I get what you're saying, though, and it's nice of you to take her. Why don't you head back to the house? Cindy said. It'll be nice and quiet. You could write for another couple of hours. Max swallowed and shuffled his feet. I haven't been able to get anything done since the sweater thing. I'm sorry. Cindy was surprised to find that she meant it. Would you mind if I joined the two of you? Of course not. Cindy looked down at her watch. We'd better get going if we want to make it in time. Did you drive your car over here? Max nodded. You can follow me. The church isn't far, but it's not easy to find. They were lucky and found some of the last seats in the old building. Max had been right. The small church was packed. By the time they started to sing the first hymn, it was standing room only. That was a nice service. Just what I needed, Karen said as the three of them walked back into the crisp night air. Cindy agreed. The message of hope and forgiveness the service offered had been a balm to her troubled heart. The hour-long service had given her time to think. Max wasn't anything like Jeff, she'd come to realize, and it wasn't fair of her to judge one by her experience with the other. Max took her hand. I hope to see you at home in a little while. He let go and strolled off to find his car. Chapter 8. Christmas Day. I got you a little something. Max walked into the kitchen. Something smells amazing. What is that? He stepped up behind her to glance over her shoulder. Breakfast casserole. Nothing fancy, but it tastes good. Cindy had woken up early and decided to cook since she couldn't go back to sleep. They had talked a little more after church last night. She'd told him about Jeff and how the sweater incident had brought up years of bad memories. He'd seemed understanding, and more importantly, he felt horrible about what had happened. Unlike with her ex, she believed Max's apology and his promise to keep his temper under control no matter how stressed he got. Did you get any sleep? She asked. By the time she'd gone to bed, he'd been busy typing away on that laptop of his. A couple of hours. She turned around and looked at him. He had dark circles under his eyes, but other than that, he looked more relaxed than he had all day yesterday. I got into the flow. She assumed that meant his writing had gone well. Grab some coffee, she said. I'll scoop some of this onto plates. After breakfast, Max reached for the wrapped gift he'd set on the table next to him and held it out to her. Hang on a second. I got you something too. She ran to her bedroom and grabbed the small gift bag she'd hidden in her closet. Here. She kept her eyes glued to his face, judging his reaction as he pulled out the hand-carved fountain pen made from driftwood. His eyes were wide, and the most beautiful smile lit up his entire face. Thank you. Max rose and pulled her into a tight hug. I was admiring this at the market. I know, she breathed. I went back to get it. He kissed her cheek. Your turn, he said and grabbed his gift, holding it out to her. Cindy put it down on the table to untie the twine wrapped around the simple red paper. A small tag was fastened to it that read, "To my favorite landlord." It made her smile. Just rip it, Max said impatiently when she started to lift the paper on one side. Okay, Cindy laughed and started ripping the paper off. It was strangely satisfying. Inside was a plain cardboard box with a removable lid. She lifted it and gasped. It isn't a first edition or anything, but the images are the same, Max said. Cindy was too stunned to speak. Nestled in tissue paper was a beautiful copy of A Christmas Carol. The book was old and leather-bound. Cindy lifted it from the box with shaky fingers. She carefully cracked it open and recognized the original John Leech illustrations. The color had faded a bit, but the details were amazing. It was the most beautiful book she'd ever held. I can't accept this. It must have cost a fortune, she said. It's a reproduction from the early 1900s. Not very valuable, but I thought you would like it, Max shrugged. How did you get this? Cindy was still stunned and had a hard time looking up from the book. She started to flip through some of the pages. I have a friend who owns a used bookstore in Brooklyn. He sent it overnight. Cindy shook her head. She couldn't believe his thoughtful gift. How did you know that this is your favorite book? You've been leaving your paperback copy sitting around everywhere. It wasn't difficult to guess, he smirked. Thank you. She carefully returned the book to the box before pulling him into a tight hug. It's the nicest gift anyone has ever given me. Max chuckled. We're going to have to work on that. Did that mean what she thought it meant? Max looked up from his work and sighed. He couldn't remember feeling so comfortable and happy. His present had been a huge success. Cindy had hardly put the book down since they'd exchanged gifts earlier today. She was currently curled up on the oversized chair reading it. He picked up the pen she'd given him and made a quick note about a minor character's whereabouts he needed to double-check before writing the next scene. He got up and stretched. He felt Cindy looking up at him. That was another productive writing session, he said, pride rose in his chest at the big smile on her face. Good. You've been typing away like a madman, Cindy teased. She was right. His fingers had been flying over the keys. The ideas came faster than he could write them down. He loved the feeling when the story came together and basically wrote itself. At this point, he was well ahead of schedule, and if he could ride the wave, he should finish by tomorrow. Max strode over to the chair and leaned over to kiss her. Having my muse by my side has been helping. She giggled and shook her head. I'm no muse. He disagreed. You don't have to be back at work until the 2nd, right? Max asked a moment later. Yes, why? I was hoping you would drive up to New York with me for New Year's Eve. You could fly back on the 1st. I don't know. He could tell she was tempted. I'd love to show you around the city, he said, crossing his fingers and hoping she'd say yes. Cindy bit her lip and flipped through a few more pages of her book. Let's look at flights. If it isn't too expensive, I'll come. He'd take that as a yes. Good, because I love you and I don't want to spend New Year's Eve without you." He held his breath, waiting for her reaction. The words had slipped out, but he meant them with every fiber of his heart. Cindy closed the book and stood. She wrapped her arms around him and beamed up at him with those soft brown eyes. "You know what? I love you too." It was the best Christmas present anyone had ever given him. Epilogue. New Year's Eve, New York City, New York. This is really something. Cindy still couldn't believe she was in Times Square on New Year's Eve. Well, technically they weren't in the square itself, but close enough to see all the craziness. They'd taken one look at the crowds and decided this was as close as they wanted to get. And it's freezing. She could barely feel her nose or her toes. She stomped her feet to warm up. "Wanna leave?" Max asked. "No way. This may be my only chance to experience this. I'm staying." Max chuckled and pulled her closer. "I guess we'll have to huddle for warmth then." He seemed even more relaxed and happier than he had Christmas Day. Early this morning, Max had sent in his manuscript and then taken her out to his favorite bagel shop for breakfast. Palmar Island Bakery's bagels were good, but those had been better. Cindy had enjoyed their day in the city, taking in as many sights as they could. Her favorite had been the view from the Empire State Building. She would have loved to see the Statue of Liberty up close, but there hadn't been enough time. Maybe if things worked out between her and Max, they could make it during one of her visits. If he invited her back. "I can't believe how fast today has gone by and how much we've seen. It'll take me all day tomorrow to recover." She smiled, feeling a little sad that their time together would come to an end around 12 tomorrow when she had to head out to catch her flight. "At least I'll be able to nap on the plane." Aunt Lydia had always encouraged her to look on the bright side, and she was trying. Max squeezed her tighter. "How would you feel about driving back instead?" he asked. Her breath caught. "What?" "I've been thinking about it since we left your house. I love it down there and wouldn't mind looking for a place of my own. I was kinda hoping you would put up with me for a little while longer while I house shop. I'm sure Chloe can find me something in no time." Cindy pushed back so she could look at him. "Are you serious? About moving down to Palmar Island?" Max nodded. "Absolutely. I don't really like the idea of a long-distance relationship. How about it? Can I stay?" His smirk made her heart melt. Out of the corner of her eye she saw the ball start to drop. It was almost midnight. Of course. Cindy couldn't hold the laughter and joy in that bubbled up in her chest. She had a feeling her huge grin looked ridiculous, but Max didn't seem to mind. He bent down and pulled her to him. "Good," he said before claiming her mouth with his. The new year was about to start, and she was getting her kiss early. Cindy didn't mind. She couldn't wait for the year to start. The future suddenly seemed full of exciting possibilities. "Happy New Year," he mumbled between kisses. The end. This has been Stuck at the Beach for Christmas. Written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2019 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2022 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.